Hey folks, welcome to Oregon Cash Flow Pro. Thanks for joining me today. We are going to go over the pros and cons of renting versus buying your home. Stick around and we'll get right into it.
Oregon Cash Flow Pro offers free money management advice to help you take control of your finances. And now here's your host, personal finance enthusiast and licensed insurance broker, James Barber.
Before we get started, be sure to hit the subscribe button along with the notification bell so that you can be notified of upcoming videos. Now let's get into it. General rule number 1. If the cost to rent is more than 1% of the cost to buy the house, then you're better off buying the house. And if the cost to rent is lower than 1% of the cost of the house, then you're probably better off renting. Now that's just a general rule. Of course, there are exceptions. The idea behind this general rule is, where is it better to put your money? Is it better to put your money into an expensive house and lock it up there? Or are you better off renting that house and putting that extra money into an investment? And the reason that we go with 1% is because typically that's what real estate investors look for when they're looking to buy a house to rent. If you can buy the house and have rents right around 1%, then that's a good purchase. But we've got areas like on our coast where a rental cost might be 0.4% of the cost of the house, in which case you're much better off renting that property and putting your money elsewhere to invest. General rule number 2, if you're not going to live there long term, think 7 years or more, then you're better off to rent. The idea behind this general rule is that there's a lot of costs involved when it comes to buying and selling real estate. So if you're not going to be in that house long enough to recoup those costs from buying and from selling, then you're better off to rent. Now, of course, there's exceptions. You might be in an area that sees great appreciation in just a couple of years. Fine, if that's what you're getting into, then you might want to put more weight into buying than into renting. And general rule number 3, don't buy or rent more house than you need without a purpose. The idea is, the larger the house, the bigger the expenses. The higher the taxes, the more the maintenance, the more it costs to insure. Everything goes up when the size of the house goes up. So the larger the house, the greater the expenses. Now the reason I say don't buy more than you need without a purpose, because if you have a reason for having that extra space to offset that cost, then go for it. As an example, you don't want to get an extra bedroom in the house if you're going to have in-laws over once a year. If that's the case, you're probably better off putting them up in a hotel room rather than going to the extra expense of having a more expensive house, higher taxes, higher utility bills, everything that is associated with just having that extra room. Now, if you're going to use that extra room and Airbnb it out in the meantime, then that could really be worth it. And you'll want to factor that in to your calculations. All right, let's get into the pros and cons of renting. Pro number 1, you don't own it. You don't have to worry about the major cost of repairs. If you have a roof that needs replacing, if the water heater goes out, anything happens to that place, you are not on the hook for it. That is a major plus to renting. In fact, it's probably the biggest plus to renting. Pro number 2 is you have the freedom to move around and have a nomadic lifestyle. You're not tied down to any location. So when it comes to trying to figure out where you want to settle down, or if you want to spend a lot of your time traveling, then it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to own the main house that you want to be living in. You can own real estate that you rent out and you use for cash flow. That almost always makes sense. But what you don't want to do is necessarily own your own home, because your own home isn't usually bringing in any income. And pro number 3, when you're renting, you can take that time to figure out which area you want to live in long term. So if you're just moving to an area, you don't want to buy a house right away because you don't know if you're going to like the neighborhood. You don't know which neighborhood fits you the best. You don't necessarily know your neighbors if you're going to get along with them. So it's a good idea to rent for a period of time, 6 months or a year. Figure out if that really is where you want to spend a number of years in order to make that long-term investment count. And pro number 4 for renting is your rent is going to be lower than what your monthly payment is when you're buying the place and you're paying for insurance and property taxes. So pro number 4 for renting is you have extra money to put into an investment somewhere or savings or pay down your bills. Now let's move into the cons of renting. Con number 1, it's going to sound an awful lot like the first pro we had. You don't own it. So in this case, that's a bad thing because that means you're subject to the landlord's rules. You end up giving up a lot of freedoms that you would otherwise have if you were owning the place. Con number 2 is you're typically locked into long-term leases. 6 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years, whatever you need in order to get a good rate usually. Now that doesn't lock you in like buying a home into like a 5 to 7 year period to make it worthwhile, but it does lock you in and it does make it harder to get out without giving up substantial penalties. So make sure that whatever lease term you sign matches with what you think is going to be best for your lifestyle. And just try to be aware that often there's some unexpected life events that can happen that might change how long you expect to be leasing it. Con number 3, you could go with a month-to-month lease, but you may find yourself having to move within a very short period because you're subject to evictions, whether it's for cause or no cause. Sometimes you don't have a choice on whether it's time for you to move or not. And that's really one of the biggest problems with renting is it can cause a major upheaval if you unexpectedly get an eviction notice. So something to be aware of, and that's also why it's a good reason to follow the landlord's rules because you don't want to find yourself out on the street. Con number 4, you typically can't modify the house without getting approval from the landlord. So on a whim, you can't just decide to repaint the interior, or you can't change the color of the exterior. You can't move walls around. There's a lot of things that you just can't do without getting approval first because it's not your place, it's their place. And that's just one of the downsides to renting. Con number 5 is you have limited privacy. Typically, your landlord can inspect the premises with 24 hours notice, and they have access to everywhere in the house. So you really give up a lot of your privacy simply due to that alone. And con number 6, you don't get to participate in the appreciation of the house. You're paying rent, but it doesn't matter if the value of the house is going up or down to you, except in how it affects the property tax rates. If your property tax rates are going up because the house is appreciating, your rent's probably going to go up. But you don't get to participate in that. You have no access to that value of the house going up. So that's it for the pros and cons of renting. Let's move into the pros and cons of buying. Pro number 1 for buying is you own it. You get to make the rules now. That's one of the biggest benefits to being a homeowner is the ability to do what you want with the property. Pro number 2, you can modify it to fit your lifestyle. So if you want to take down a wall, or if you want to take out that carpet and put in hardwood floors, you can paint the exterior. Whatever you want to do, sometimes you have to ask for a permit from the city, but for the most part, whatever you want to do, you can do it. It is your property. Pro number 3, you get to participate in the appreciation. So as your house goes up in value, you can usually access that equity through loans or lines of credit. And that's a huge boost to being able to maintain the property and utilizing that equity for other investment purposes or emergencies as needed. And pro number 4, privacy. You don't have to let anybody come into your house if you don't want to. For some people, that is the ultimate freedom and the biggest value in owning your own home. Pro number 5 is stability. When it comes to owning your own home, you don't have to worry about evictions. You might have to worry about a foreclosure if you have a loan and you don't make those payments, but you have way more time than you would if you were renting. If you're renting, you could be out in 30 days. But if you have a mortgage and you own your home, it might take the bank a year to get you out or more. So you have this stability of a place that you can come home to, a place that you're safe, and you know that at the end of the day, whatever else is going on out there, you have a place to go to, and they're not going to be able to take that away from you without quite a bit of effort. And of course, you're going to have many opportunities to cure any breach of contract that you have with your lender. So even if you do miss a payment, you're not going to end up on the street. Whereas if you were renting and you miss a payment, you could get evicted right away. Pro number 6 is your home could be a legacy gift to your heirs. You can pass it on when you pass on. Clearly not something that's an option if you're just renting the house. Pro number 7, you can rent it out. If you do need to move, or if you want to move, or if you want to go travel for an extended period of time, you can rent out the space and be the beneficiary of that income. And pro number 8, you can sell it and take full advantage of all the appreciation that happened. You can get out from under the debt payments if it's there. You just end up with that option that you don't have if you're renting it. Now let's go into the cons of owning a home. Con number 1, you've got to pay to maintain it. So when you're renting, all those major repairs that you didn't have to worry about, you're now on the hook as a homeowner. So if you've got a roof to repair or a hot water heater goes out, you need to make sure you have the funds to fix that. Otherwise, you're probably not going to enjoy being in that house and owning that property in the future. So something to be aware of as a homeowner, you're going to have extra costs. You need to set aside those costs. You can do it into a sinking fund. You can put it into an investment account, but something that's liquid so you have access to it. Like a cash value life insurance policy could be a good place to store that extra cash for emergency repairs or high capital expense repairs like your roof. Con number 2, this is a long-term commitment. Remember we talked about 7 years or so? At least 5 to 7 years. You don't want to necessarily buy a place if you don't plan on being in it for a long time. You need enough time to recoup all of those costs from when you purchased it. You probably had realtor fees, closing costs, you might have had mortgage points that you paid. The list goes on and on. Those same expenses come about when you sell it as well. Almost all of them. Realize that it's usually not very profitable to buy a house and sell it very quickly, just because of all those extraneous expenses. Con number 3, it's hard to make sudden lifestyle changes when you're a homeowner. You can't just pick up and leave. You can't just decide to go travel for long periods of time. You need to make plans for your house to be taken care of. You might either rent it out, find a management company to handle that stuff for you, or a family member. Maybe you have somebody that house sits, or maybe you just need to sell it. But whatever the case may be, it does add a layer of difficulty when you need to make sudden lifestyle changes. And con number 4 is the high cost to buy and sell. We went over that just briefly as to why this is a long-term commitment, but there are significant costs when you buy and you sell a house. That's it for the pros and cons of buying versus renting. Hopefully you'll be able to put those to use and help make the best decision for you.